you can mute and unmute. It's on the mic.
Ivy, you there?
Yes, hello.
Ivy, sorry, I just have a quick question. When I look at the list of attendees, I'm seeing Anne-Marie's name repeated about 10 or 11 times. Why is that?
I'm not too sure. That might just be from Zoom's end.
But her name is appearing
Yeah,
as
I'm
an
not too-
attendee.
yeah. So she is attending. I think it's just repeated. Maybe I'll ask her how many windows
Yeah.
she has open.
We'll just give a couple of more minutes for people to log on. Rohan, can you turn your mic off for the time being, please? Thank you. Okay, good morning, everybody. We'll start now as we seem to have a few more numbers come online. So thank you to those who have taken the opportunity to do that this morning. As I said, welcome. I would now like to ask Alo from Samoa Coconut Cluster to open the webinar with a word of prayer. Thank you, Alo.
Thank you, Trade Commissioner. Let's just bow our heads and say a few words. Mātou te mairangi, I e pēlo swaf. Mātou o lia meleni asfo. A pēo na mātou potpotu. O ngā hui o penga whanu. Ia tekundosi ni on pō. A pēo na maua i se whilo inga. Mas whituwha inga. Manatu I nei that's Pasifika. O wale leo atunu tai tasi ro fa peona fa just mele nei o onga ia fa just maila o fio fa peona musmusu ino mato mafofa nei maoni mato mafofunga lei o wale pa sia fo yo ni o awala fo e manuia ai atunu tai tasi o atu Pasifika ia talot le lo fio wale ne yaso ma na fofuanga a mata le manuia ia fa peon fai manuia ia tala le asie supervisor lo swafo lo pele to tas mani fala ba au no sa tawo na mato sa amen.
Amen. Thank you very, very much, Alo. Appreciate that. So good morning, folks, and welcome to our Path to Market webinar 2021. My name is Glynis Miller, and I head the Pacific Trade Invest New Zealand team here in Auckland. I will facilitate the webinar today and tomorrow, so do bear with me. I'd like to, at this juncture, acknowledge and thank everyone who has registered. I think our numbers this morning was well over 100. Thank you. We have a solid lineup of speakers for you. Many of them leaders in their fields. You will get to hear perspectives and insights from those in the business of buying, distributing and exporting. Put together, this year's Path to Market webinar is packed with insights on what to do, more importantly, what not to do, the hows and whys, and the list goes on. At Pacific Trade Invest New Zealand, we serve all 16 member countries of the forum. To connect and facilitate trade and investment interests from the Pacific Island countries with New Zealand. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, PTNI New Zealand, like most businesses around the globe, needed to be agile enough to look beyond the norm, recognizing quite quickly that the world of trade as we knew it was going to be very different. We used the opportunity to push our brand presence in New Zealand, to interface on a more personal level with importers and distributors and buyers and other agencies in New Zealand. We reckon our efforts are paying off, as evidenced by the fact that we have secured the support of MG Marketing, MPI, and other leading persons in their fields as presenters in this webinar this morning and tomorrow. Our region, ladies and gentlemen, is compounded by challenges, as we know, not least our remoteness, our small scale, our isolation from global markets, supply, and more recently, high freight costs. Be that as it may, we're seeing unbelievable diversity and commitment by SMEs across the Pacific in their quest to get product to market. Our small team at Pacific Trade Invest New Zealand is dedicated to helping find the right fit for your export. We're committed to providing tailor-made solutions for exporters across all sectors, though mainly in agriculture and fisheries, as that is where we're seeing the highest concentration of exports from the Pacific into New Zealand. You can learn more about what we do and who we are on our website, www.pacifictradeinvest.co.nz. To conclude, I'd like to acknowledge my team at Pacific Trade Invest New Zealand in Auckland. I'd like to also acknowledge the presenters. I'd also like to acknowledge the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat in Suva, Fiji, our member governments of the Forum for their support, to our donor, the Government of New Zealand, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and particularly to every one of our presenters for this webinar. I do hope you enjoy the program, Vinaka. So with those few words, you're going to have to get used to my voice over the next few hours of today. Sorry about that. But it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker in our first session. As we move into the main program, in the first session, you will hear from two presenters, beginning with our very own Trade Development Manager, Rohan Lord, who will provide a general overview of New Zealand's trade with the Pacific. I think it's important to get that perspective in line before we drill down into some of the technical matters of trade. Following Rohan's presentation, we will be joined by Mr. Alo Koloneva'ai, Director of Samoa Coconut Cluster from APIA. As for the Q&A sessions, please use the Q&A function to post your questions, and we will get to them at the end of the day or as time dictates. You can use the chat function to share your general comments or insights to any of the topics covered. So on to the first session. Rohan, welcome. The floor is yours, and you have 10 minutes to conclude your presentation.
Thank you, Glynis, and all the other presenters. I work alongside Ord and feel very privileged to actually be able to be in a position to attempt to drive exports from the Pacific Islands to New Zealand. So I'm going to give a quick snapshot on the New Zealand market and the Pacific. So really, in the overview of New Zealand Pacific with trade is that with New Zealand, the Pacific Island countries, per annum exports to New Zealand equates to 94,000 tonnes, and that was pre-COVID, 2019. And that equates to 96 million in trade, in value. So the key takeout here really is that while value is increasing, volume is decreasing. So I guess in a positive way, you're earning more money for doing less. Over the previous 5 years, I'd just like to highlight the value has increased 12% and the volume has dropped 4%. Now, the source of this is from Global Trade Atlas, and the reason for the drop in volume over the last 5 years is due to the decline in calcium phosphate sales from Nauru. Okay, now we're going to look at the Pacific trade as a pie of the New Zealand market. So it represents 0.22% of volume and 0.17% of value. But it's really important to remember here that there's a worldwide inflationary trend, that value is increasing and it's higher than the volume growth. Looking at this slide here, this represents a chart by country as to the size of the trade with New Zealand that it represents. And this one is by volume. And so as you can see, if you work around from 12 o'clock at the top of the clock, Fiji's got 61%, Papua New Guinea 13%, Solomon Islands 11%, Samoa at 8%, French, Polynesia and Tonga at 2%, New Caledonia 1%, same with Vanuatu, Cook Islands at 1% as well. And the others, while really important, are at no percent, but that's only a rounding error. Now this slide here represents imports by country. Now don't look at the detail too much, it tracks across by year, but what I'd like you to have a look at is where the arrow points. By volume, it is down 44% from 2021 to 2020, and it's listed by country. Now this slide here, once again, forget the detail, just look at the green arrow, please. And this paints a really positive story where value is up by 24%. And in this slide here, what I've tried to do is capture all the countries by alphabetical order, what their key exports are. So I won't go right through into detail, but Cook Islands, iron and steel and apparel and pearls and precious items feature high in the ranking as value. Now with Fiji, it's fairly evident, veggies and root crops are high performers. And what's really interesting with Fiji is that wood doesn't appear as it has done in previous years. And that's because I believe possibly the certification has affected imports into New Zealand. French Polynesia is strong with iron and steel through to wood pulp. Marshall Islands on rubber. New Caledonia, or slag and ash, chemicals. Niue, vegetables, fruits and root crops. Papua New Guinea is quite diverse, wood through to plastics, and the plastics features there is high on value. Samoa is a strong performer with veggies and root crops, right through to electrical machinery, which is high on value. Solomon Islands, wood, malt starch inulin, fats and oils. Tongas, veggies, root crops, through to oil seeds and grains. And Vanuatu, veggies, root crops, through to coffee and tea. That's the end of my session. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rohan, for those overview comments and to portray some interesting data and stats on Pacific Island countries' exports to New Zealand. I was quite intrigued by Marshall Islands rubber. I wonder what that constitutes. Our next presenter, gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. Alo Kolone Va'ai, Managing Director for Samoa Coconut Cluster Limited. Welcome, Alo. Alo is the current Vice President for the Samoa Cocoa Industry Association and owner of one of the hotels on his family plantation in Savaii. The Samoa Coconut Cluster represents a revolution for not only farmers in Samoa, but all over the world. It was created to support farmers by providing access to information on how to grow crops sustainably, and they also aim to bring efficient direct access to customers all over the world. We look forward to your presentation, Alo, a very powerful statement in your bio, and we welcome. The floor is yours. You have 10 minutes to conclude your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, to go. Can you see the presentation, Matt? Hello?
Yes, we can, but maybe you need to expand it. So just click on the function down the bottom so that it takes up the whole screen. We can also, yeah, and also the one down the bottom. Nope. Yep.
You can see it.
Yep, that's the one. Click on that. Oh, I see. Okay, great. Yep. Yes, go ahead. Yep.
Well, I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, but talofa, as Madam Trade Commissioner has already introduced me. So as a farmer, we started this our company in 2015. But started operating in 2016. Initially, we started because we were working with some of women in business doing coconut oil, virgin coconut oil. Before, from 2000 to 2015, we saw that there was an avenue for the farmers, especially the processors who were working with women in business, to to produce virgin coconut oil efficiently using machinery. Because the method they were using back then was more labor intensive. And when we found some challenges with them to work on that, so we formed our own cluster and our own company. That's where we started Salmon Coconut Cluster. That's just a background on how we started, the challenges that we faced. But our vision was to create a real value for farmers and to create more income for them, for their coconuts and their products and their goods from the farm, trying to eliminate the middlemen who were taking most of the percentage of the money that they were earning. So it was more towards gauging the farmers to earn more from their products. And we wanted to utilize state-of-the-art technology to ensure that we would meet that standard that we wanted, and also to meet the market quality standards. And also that the fair price for the suppliers, especially the farmers, will be have a fair price on their hard-earned sweat products that they get from their farms. Keys to success, I guess, when you go into a business like this, there were some things that we sort of started looking at after setting up our company, but we found out that understanding the market, technology, access to markets, maintaining quality, and also the human resource part was pretty important. And of course, finance was also a big part in order for this sort of venture to be successful. Technology was what we had to ask ourselves, some of the questions when we were looking for technology. What sort of machines we needed, the target volumes that we, or capacity of the machines, what can they produce, how much the volume of tonnage or liters that each capacity of the machines can put out, and also the capacity of the farmers that will be sourcing or supplying the raw materials for the machinery. Also, where you get your machinery, we found out the hard way. We went to China to get food because it was cheaper. Well, that's what we first thought. And regardless of the quality, we found out the hard way. The cost of the machinery was not really the important part. It was more the quality of the machinery. So you have to really understand where you source your machinery from, and also the quality. I guess nowadays, maybe 5 years now, I think China has already increased the quality of their machinery since the days that we first came into operation and sourced our machinery from China. Market access, we found out also that there is always a lot of regulations, also certifications that needed. We were organically certified when we first started, set up our own ICS. But when had a few internal problems with our company, we shifted operations to Hawaii because we started off here in Tuvalu, the main island. But we're now based where most of the raw material is sourced. But during that transition, we sort of lapsed on our organic certification. We were just going to start again, but COVID came along and threw a spanner in the works. So we are now organically not certified at the moment. Also HACCP, ISO, good manufacturing practices, kosher, especially for the Jewish, was needed by the US market, which all the markets we were targeting targeting, which is the main one they were after, was the organic certification. And also developing social media, social marketing. So that's a big platform that's now being used by most people, online marketing, especially with COVID. We also need to step up on that part of it to develop our market access. Quality control, yeah, we have guests here with that. It's already been covered before the certification that's needed. So we really need to maintain quality, and also using those certifications will be a good way of gauging where we are. And also equipment needs to be maintained so we can fully produce at a efficient level. Human resources, staff, of course, training, especially in our production process with the machinery, which should be a key part on people. In maintaining our quality and also moving forward to meet the requirements of our markets overseas. But also finance. Yeah, we do face a lot of financial difficulties at the moment, especially with the organic certification. That's a must for dealing overseas at the moment. We're trying, we found some markets who do not require organic certification in New Zealand, but those were more or less small markets. But that's the only certification that we really need at the moment, to because that's the only certification that whenever we find a market overseas, that's the first requirement. Are you organically certified, and where's your organic certification in order for us to export or to access those markets. Challenges, yeah, when we I've already mentioned the equipment, right? Equipment was a major hurdle for us. After spending initially hundreds of thousands of dollars to get the machinery in, we now only find that there is only 10% of our machinery from China still functional. We were lucky to access some funding from CIDP, which from the European Union, which basically refinanced all our machinery that we have now. And we were able to, learning from the first mistakes that we had, we really did our homework on this one. And we now have full functional machines that are running at 100% efficiency, sourced from Philippines. Also the organic certification, as you can see, yeah, and also we do have some markets now also from China, but they require HACCP and ISO certification. The volumes they ask are more manageable, not the high volume ones, but all we need now is just to get on top of the certifications. And also the diversification of our product offerings for business to remain operating. We see a lot of value-added products, byproducts, using virgin coconut oil, but we're also going into sourcing other products like breadfruit flour, dried fruits. We're all looking at those products using some of the machinery that we got for our virgin coconut oil to diversify our offerings and also still maintain our true belief in sourcing from our farmers. Where we are today, like I just said, yeah, we did successful application CIDP, and the final hurdle for us is very important is that organic certification from HACCP and ISO and some other certifications that we need in order to fully utilize capacity from our new machinery that we have from Philippines. We can produce around 5 to 6 to 7 tons of virgin coconut oil per month, fully utilized, and also getting all the certification in place. Oops. Can you still hear me? Hello?
Yes, you can continue.
Oh, sorry. So that's the crux of our presentation. Some advice, if you are going to go into these sort of processing, manufacturing, especially virgin coconut oil, we found out there were a lot of challenges. Unfortunately, we jumped into this in 2015 with our eyes closed. We knew that the market was out there, but we found out the hard way that we thought that once we build it, we'll get the markets. But we found out the hard way that the machines were very important. Getting the right machinery, sourcing the right machinery, and also having that already existing market pathway would have been very beneficial if we started off the right way. But we were so passionate about setting it up and running it. Plus, we had access to some financing, setting it up from our agribusiness through ADB. We managed to get funding from that to set up our initial company. But if this was an easy thing, I guess a lot of people would be doing it here in the Pacific. But yeah, those were the things that we found out the hard way. So just we found out the hard way that it was not easy, but through the grace of God and also the help of family and also some of the government as well, and some of the organizations, we've been managed to stay afloat. But we see a very positive outlook in the future, especially with we're still dealing with the markets overseas. They're just waiting for our organic certification and all certification to come on board, and then we'll proceed from there. That's the only challenge that we're facing at the moment, and also financing our certification is a bit hard, especially for an individual company. Getting funding when you have to fund yourself. I know there's a few NGOs that do it here, but they are funded by the governments. Unfortunately, for the private sector in Samoa, we're not funded by the government when we're sourcing funding for this sort of important part of our business, which is the certification. But when there's a will, there's a way. So we'll find a way to still manage to find a way. So I guess just the importance of this workshop is sharing, and also where we can help each other overcome some of the challenges going forward into the future. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alo. Some really, really strong messages there in your presentation, and really, really good to hear of the efforts that your company made, and also, recognizing your shortcomings and what you, as you pointed out, you started off on the wrong foot, and your learnings and where you are today is because you made a concerted effort and you were committed to your program. So congratulations. And the other reason I just wanted to point out is that having people like Alo and his representing his cluster in Samoa gives the rest of us an opportunity to interact offline with Alo. Feel free to contact him to pick his brains on some of the learnings and some of the recommendations that he may have for you if you're thinking of embarking on forming some clusters or collective within your sectors back in your home countries. Thank you very, very much, Alo, and please do stay online to answer questions at the end of the sessions. Folks, we're getting a lot of comments about the presentation, so I thought I'd just let you know that we will, at the end of the day, at the end of tomorrow, we will circulate copies of the presentations, as well as a list of contacts of all the presenters so that you may contact them on your own accord. So thank you very much, Alo. Just moving on, in our next presentation, we will hear from Rohan again to take you through some of the concepts of export readiness and export ready. This session actually asks a pertinent question: is your business export ready or export capable? In our work at Pacific Trade Invest, we come across this, we have to ask this question every day, every minute of every day, to those that we receive inquiries. As in our experience, a lot of companies, SMEs in the Pacific, come to us with a product wanting to export to New Zealand. Our responsibility to that company or to any company is to decipher, first of all, whether or not they're export ready. The exercise that Rohan will take you through this morning will hopefully give you some understanding of the difference between the two. So thank you, Rohan. The floor is yours for your 10 minutes.
Thank you, Glynis.
Are you running your presentation or is Ivy doing it?
Can you see my presentation?
No. Yep, now we can see it. Do you want to go to full screen? Yep, perfect.
Yep.
Thanks, Rohan.
Great. I'll just bear with me. I'll just move this across here. Okay, thank you, Glynis, and thank you, Alo. And it was really interesting that some of the things that you mentioned there illustrates how tough a journey it can be having your own business. And I've had my own business with large borrowings, and I fully understand with some of those, challenges which you mentioned. And some of that comes out in this survey here. So the survey was sent out, and thank you for the respondents who sent them all back in. And what the surveys try to do is to illustrate through the survey whether your business is export capable or export ready. And on the top part of it, where it says underneath, do you have the following? That is really establishing whether you're capable, export capable. And it goes through various questions like, is your product ready to export? Have you got a planned growth strategy? Have you got the commitment to grow the business into an export market? The commitment to become an exporter means actually you've got to get out to the market and visit the buyers and see whether it stacks up in terms of margin. Have you got a unique selling point? Also logistics. And then the next one is ability to assign financial resources. Now this you'll see in the survey results after this slide is a key obstacle or challenge. So it appears a lot of businesses go into this process, this pathway, but aren't capitalized enough to do that, whether it's for machinery, for production, or logistics, or other factors as well. And then the next one is understanding the company will need to require coaching in particular areas in the overseas markets that you're going to target, and also at a minimum, do you have marketing materials? And then the next step leads into the next stage with, okay, you're export ready. So you've got the export knowledge, you've got the export commitment, which is thorough, and then resources, again key, enough capital. Have you got the labor, export market logistics, a buyer, a market? And on the resources side, all the certification and documentation to enter the New Zealand market or other markets that you might be targeting, and then the supply capability. Quite a few times this has come up with some buyers that the supply at times can be inconsistent and the quality can be inconsistent. So that's a real opportunity to have a unique selling point. If you increase the quality and quantity as per the demand after the initial pipeline full, that can really work in your favour. Okay, so once again, thanks for all those that sent them in, the surveys, and let's have a look at the results. So out of the 16 that we received, this is focusing on the export capable side, which is the step before export ready. If you just look at the two arrows, which point to growth strategy, this is where the opportunity is, having a growth strategy and then moving across financial resources, which is consistent with what Ella was saying, and also Anthony Akoi when he comes on with his presentation. So the financial resources, like a lot of us go into this with a planned strategy, which is quite thin, but it can get us through. But the financial resources is absolutely key, and that needs to be thought through. And there's service in-country service providers, which will be highlighted by Richard Busby from Pacific Business Link later tomorrow. So moving on to export ready. Similar picture, but not quite as strong. Once again, full, if we look at the two arrows, full export resources and the supply capability is the ones that we really need to focus on to be export ready. So that's the end of session 2. Any questions, please ask at the end, as Glenn's pointed out. So thank you.
Thanks, Rohan. I wonder if you could just go back to the checklist again.
This one?
Yes, that one. So I'd imagine that the key takeaway from this list, and I'm sure there could be other pertinent questions or criteria that we could, that could be listed here. But I guess in the Q&A session at the end, I'd be interested to hear from participants online their reactions to this, and particularly whether they actually have a process whereby they, they think through, or they take themselves through, or take their business through a checklist of their own to determine, or to give them some insights whether or not they consider themselves to be export capable or export ready. So that's number one. Number two is if you could just spend probably a couple of more minutes honing in on some of the key statements there. And from your perspective as a trade development manager for Pacific Trade Invest New Zealand, and you're using your background and knowledge, what would you say would be, if you were to put that list into a priority, what would be number 1 through to number, I don't know, 10 or 6?
Are you talking about the ready one at the bottom or the capable at the top?
Both.
Okay. So I think really, while the ready one at the bottom goes in more depth, I think if we look at the capable, I think a planned growth strategy would be number 1, assuming that you've got a product which is marketable in the market, and then after following that would be financial resources to enter the market. Now, I think that we've got cash flow and P&L templates, and they cover margin and costing. So I think that if you do a cash flow analysis with a P&L, and it's well thought out, and it's one consistent with the template that we've got, and it's consistent with, say, like a bank, for example, ANZ, the one that they use. If you go through in every bit of detail which they ask, and it'd only be 20 lines long, everything would be thought about from your pricing, your supply side on costings, how much you're going to sell. That means you've got to think about the market. You've got to think about all your operating expenses, whether it's overheads like rates or power or labour. If you're going to step up to export, how much extra labour that you might need, other costs like in-country documentation, logistics. So everything is covered off by those cash flow and P&L templates. So I think that would be the priority. And then secondly, if we go down to the export ready supply capability, it's really, really key, because we have this feedback a lot. The opportunity is quantity and quality. And then on moving aside from that, is really addressing what the customer or the buyer, what they need in terms of, like, initially a pipeline full, and then the reorder quantity after that, and also their margin expectations as well. And that varies between the category and the product, and whether you're a new entrant and you're pitched high at the top end, and, like, for example, organics. If you're doing lower volume, you're providing a higher margin, but if you're a brand leader and a volume driver, you can get away with a lower margin. But it's really interesting on the supply capability, and it'll be reflected in the financials as well, is that if you're going to target grocery, you need to be very, very mindful of the trade spend element, and that is like the cost of money to be in grocery. When I started in grocery, we could start at the volume drivers of 3%, and by the time I moved into another category, in terms of trade had changed, we'd gone to net, that had gone to 40%. So those are the extreme levels of trade spend. And some businesses go in there and they get surprised at the cost of doing business. And it ranges from ullage to settlement to scan outer allowance to co-op fees, to in-store promoting. So it just needs to be really, really mindful. You need to be really, really mindful of those. So I hope that helps.
Thanks, Rohan. I'm sure there'll be, I can see some questions coming online, which we will attend to shortly, but I see from the program that you've got the next session as well. So why don't we just dive right into that?
Okay, just bear with me, I'm just moving my screen around so I can see certain parts. Okay.
So while Rohan is getting his slide ready, ladies and gentlemen, you'll see from the program that this session takes you through, another checklist, but we'll also highlight the importance of IHS, customs, HACCP labeling, and we'll hear more of that in the coming presentations today and tomorrow from some of the agencies, as well as case studies like the coconut cluster we had this morning on their journey towards getting certification. And I think that's coming through as a strong point. I can see some questions around certification. Hopefully the following presentations will answer some of your questions. But in the meantime, Rohan, the floor is yours, and you're going to take us through some checklists relating to New Zealand imports around customs and IHS, etc. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Glynis. So the reason this slide came about is coming into this role, I was putting myself in a position, and I've been in different industries, and I was thinking, okay, someone wants to export a product to New Zealand. What process should they follow to do that? And obviously depends industry specific, whether you're frozen or fresh or ambient, chilled, or whether it's whether you're in wood or frozen fruit, for example. It might change a bit, but there can be a generic process to find out about the best way to export and what you need to do to export into New Zealand. So, and I've put this list past another industry expert, but it gives a broad framework. If we just follow step by step. So step number one is check the MPI site. And in the following slide, what I've done is I've put the website link so you can just go straight to that and then follow it through, the steps through, to find out what is required and is there a pathway that meets the IHS standard to import into this country. Frozen's easier than fresh in agricultural products. So, and then two, check New Zealand Customs site for restrictions and the approval process. Third, HACCP certification relevant for food. Some food can get in without HACCP certification, so that's something else you could look at, especially with frozen. Is your labelling NZ compliant with GS1? Is it compliant there? If it can't be, if the labelling, if the challenge is doing it from supply country, possibly you could do it here in New Zealand. Step number 5, ensure production, resource and financial capability. Once again, that financial capability comes up again. And like alluded to before, Richard from Business Link Pacific can help with certain templates in that area, and also Pacific Trade Invest, like I mentioned before, have templates for that. 6, establish trading structure, legal, including IP, tax and operations. 7, select cost-effective freight options. Now the Incoterms, you know, is it best to do it FOB, CIF? Where do you take the risk? Do you want to take the risk with reduce the risk by FOB or free alongside, or do you want to carry it all the way through for CIF? And CIF might be required to get to a market. You go air versus sea. We know about all of the disruptions that we've had. If some clients have reported by sea, just to keep the credibility of flow and product in from the Pacific Islands to meet the market. Do you go LCL, consolidated, or FCL, ambient, chilled or frozen? Now, one of our key partners, we've got a presentation tomorrow, EIF. They can do start to finish from collection, clearance, delivery, customs and biosecurity compliance. Because once again, from our meetings with them, it's come up quite a few times that they've mentioned to us, if only they came to us at the start, we could have saved them a lot of money. Once again, if they only came to us at the start, we could have saved them a lot of money and any surprises. So they're a great point to start, EIF. Select cost-effective warehousing and distribution model. Now, there are different options there. Once again, EIF could help with that. We've got Jay from Ashon Ventures who's presenting later on, and he'll talk about what they can do as well. The warehousing distribution, if you use a third-party provider, can be quite expensive. So that needs to be thought about carefully when you do like your cash flow and P&L to enter into the New Zealand market. Step number 9, registering with New Zealand Customs and MPI as if you're an import fooder, and if you're an importing food, then register as a food importer. And lastly, if required, secure a local export license. So moving on to the next slide. As I mentioned before, this slide here, if you utilize these links, can give you a step-by-step, as best possible procedure to find out where, you know, your product or services qualify and what's the best process to go about it. So if you work through this list and you have any feedback to us over time, please forward it on to me. Be very interested. And with the, if you go down to step 10, export licenses may vary product by country, and your local relevant ministry can assist with that. Okay, with labelling requirements, this targets specifically New Zealand, and I'm assuming other markets, for example, like Australia, would be consistent with this. It must have a use by and packing date, product name or description must be on there. It must have a barcode for retail. The name of the physical address of the manufacturer, the importer, and the distributor. A postal address is not sufficient, so it has to be physical. Warning and advisor statements of certain ingredients are used, such as eggs, gluten, nuts, etc. And there's a certain size requirement for that. A list of ingredients from largest to smallest amount, including water. Use and storage instructions. Nutritional information panel. Country of origin. It must be labelled in English. Additional languages are permitted. Label information must be legible and predominantly displayed in contrast with background. There's certain particular specific information that if you contact us later on following this presentation from GS1 that can help with this in more detail. But this is the guideline. And here's an example. So date best before, you know, that's step number one. That's key priority, is the best before. Organic turmeric powder, this is an example. Barcode, manufacturer, the physical address, the warnings, description 100%, organic turmeric powder, use and storage instructions, laboratory results, country of origin, Cook Islands, label in English, labeling rules, information. So that points out an example. And that concludes that presentation. Like I said, please feel free, if you want any more information on that, contact us. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohan. Could you just leave your slides up on the screen for a sec, please? Yeah. So to those who are online, the points Rohan illustrated here about labeling, this is specific to the New Zealand market, of course. And Rohan, your slide before this as well, please.
That one?
Yeah, the checklist. Yeah, checklist. I think some of these points will come through in more detail in the following presentations, and we'll answer some of the questions that I'm seeing popping up on the Q&A function. So I'm just looking at the time, and I just want to thank Rohan again for his presentation. And before we get into what I consider to be the juicy stuff, we've got MPI following, we've got Kelton. Anthony will talk to us about the Kelton Group's journey towards HACCP and some other features of their business to share as a case study, and also a very, very interesting presentation by Ashen Ventures, which I'm sure you'll find and will appreciate some of the messages that Jay will impart. So before we get into those three presentations, I just want to take this time to allow a few questions as I see them coming in. So I'm just going to, if you can bear with me, and direct some of the questions to as they're appearing on the Q&A. So the questions around certification for the Samoa virgin coconut oil, and there's a question around supply and demand for Pacific products, and equipment that Alo, your company, sourced from China. So I'm just going to, if you allow me, direct these questions to you, Alo, if you don't mind. You can view the questions yourselves, otherwise I'll read them out as they appear here. So for Alo, the questions for you in response to your presentation is, the organic certification is demanded on your product, Samoa virgin coconut oil. Is that for all agri products? A related question, Alo. Or is it, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. So.
Oh, thank you. All right. So I'll just repeat the question. It's come through for you, Alo. The
Yes.
organic certification is demanded on your products, on your product,
Yes.
Samoa coconut, I'm sorry, Samoa virgin oil, coconut virgin oil. Is that for
Yes.
all agri products, or is it levied for all Pacific products to get ahead of the demand? And so that's one around certification. The other question to you, Alo, is on equipment from China. Who led you, or how did you get to cast your attention on the Philippines? You mentioned some sourcing from Philippines, or is all your machinery coming from China? So just two questions for you, Alo.
Okay. Do you have to answer it now?
Yes, please, if you don't mind. I think it would be beneficial.
Yeah, with the organic certification, it was more geared towards the virgin coconut oil. But also with that in mind, we had to make sure that all the coconut that we collect from has to be collected from farms that were organically certified through the certifiers bodies usually from we were certified by BioGrow, so all our farmers were certified under BioGrow in our cluster. So we had to make sure that all our ICS or members were meeting the requirements and for to be organics to still stay on the certification, organic certified. So BioGrow was our certifier for that, and also for our exports going to overseas at that time. At the moment now that we're trying to set up our certification again, yeah, we're trying to work with ISO or with BioGrow again, but we have faced some problems getting the auditors coming over, especially with COVID. So that was the challenges that we faced, and getting the auditors to come and re-establish our ICS. We have been talking to government at the moment if there's a way of government to help out in that situation, but we're still waiting. So with regards to China, we sourced our, we went online. Some of my partners were sourced our equipment online through internet, dealing with some companies in China. Fortunately, we learned the hard way that yeah, there was one way of we didn't have somebody overseas to check the equipment. That was our first mistake before we shipped over the machinery. So I guess, like we said, we learn as we go along, but it was a very expensive mistake to learn from. But we were lucky from CIDP, as I said, EU. One of our partners also had contacts with, I think it was Peter in Fiji. He's also doing virgin coconut oil. And he said that he was sourcing his equipment from Philippines. So we got into contact with Mr. Antonio in Philippines, and we were able to get funding to go over to Philippines and site the machines. So we were lucky in that part, in that regard, that we were able to go to Philippines and get to see the actual machines in action, and to help us to come and set up the machines here in Samoa. So for 2 weeks we were in Philippines, studying and working and learning the ins and outs of the machinery before we got it here at Samoa. So that was a good part of the CIDP. So we learned from the first mistakes we did in China, that we had to, somebody should have gone to China, or we should have had a reliable source in China to go in and inspect the machinery. So was that answer the questions?
Yes.
So,
That's
yeah.
good. Yeah. Thanks very much, Alo. I just have one more question for you that's popped up, and then we'll move on to back into the program. The question is, Alo, recognizing your challenges of not being able to get the right certification for export to specific countries, did you look at the opportunity to promote your product to the region, that is to other Pacific Island countries, as well as build up the domestic market to help you,
Yes.
With your product selling? And if you did, how did that work for you, particularly if you're selling to other Pacific Island countries?
Yeah, we didn't really use that forum, especially there were a lot of I know there are a lot of trade forums and trade expos that we've only just had one at the moment. That was through Chamber, but that's going to Dubai, the trade expo in Dubai. So this is the first one that we've actually gone on. We did have some local ones here in Samoa, and the response was very positive. So we are supplying some local markets here in Samoa with some of the local retailers, wholesalers, and also some of the massage establishments here. So we do have a market here locally, but I guess with volumes that to keep us afloat, yeah, we really need the export market side of it as well. So yeah, but yes, we have used some of that trade expos, but not much really. We haven't really utilized that part of the yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Alo, and I really appreciate you taking the time and staying on the webinar to answer the questions. So there are a few other questions that's popped up in relation to HACCP certification, labeling and packaging, freight. I think these can be well addressed in the coming presentation. So I do thank you for your questions and to bear with us for a little bit longer while we hear from the other presenters. So thank you, Alo. Thank you, Rohan. We will now move back into the main program. And our next presenter is, where are we? Our next presenter needs no introduction. A regional public servant for over a decade, Nadar spent his formative years in trade facilitation and biosecurity with the Secretariat of the Pacific Community in Suva, as it was known then, before joining a New Zealand MPI in the early 2000s. Nadar is a specialist advisor, Pacific Imports, Horticulture Imports, Animal and Plant Health Directorate with the Biosecurity New Zealand with the Ministry of Primary Industries. Nadar will be joined this afternoon by his colleague Alipate Damaivuna, beg your pardon, who will speak to food safety under the Food Act 2014, New Zealand's Food Act. Gentlemen, welcome. I very much appreciate MPI's support towards and coming alongside Pacific Trade Invest New Zealand to join us this afternoon on this webinar. Many of you online would have heard previous presentations by MPI, but I think you'll agree with me that this afternoon's presentation is a little bit more detailed, a bit more focused, intentionally so, and we certainly look forward and welcome you both. So over to you, Nava and Alipate. Naka.
Vinaka, kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, ni Sambula Vinaka, Madam Trade Commissioner and the PTI New Zealand. Thank you for the invite again, and also thank you for the kind words of welcome. As you've alluded to, I have my colleague, Mr. Alipate Ramevuna, who will also be presenting. So I'll be covering the biosecurity component of the presentation, and Mr. Ramevuna will join me and will present on the food safety component of the presentation. Thank you, Ivy. Before I start, I also would like to acknowledge our partnership with PETI, Madam Trade Commissioner and the team, and we thank you for your support, and we look forward to our continued engagement and participation in helping the Pacific Island countries. We, MPI, we were requested to present on both the food safety as well as the biosecurity. Usually our US, the importers and exporters, our traders, most of the time you don't really understand why requirements change. Sometimes it gets annoying and frustrating trying to meet the requirements that are stipulated by the importing countries, in this case New Zealand, and that is done through the regulatory authority. With biosecurity and food safety, it's the New Zealand Ministry for Primary Industries. So I thought I'll just mention at this point that with biosecurity and food safety being regulated on the ground here in New Zealand, above that sits the international, in the international space, we have the usually referred to as the Three Sisters, the Codex. They set the international standards for food safety. The International Plant Protection Convention, they set the international standard for plant and plant products for consumption. And we also have the OIE, they set the international standards for animal and animal health in terms of that space. So the Three Sisters, they are the sisters that engage at the international level purely to develop international standards to protect the countries so that contracting parties and members are able to protect their countries. And secondly is to be able to facilitate safe trade whenever those commodities under those respective international bodies are traded. With the biosecurity, the New Zealand MPI, our strategy with New Zealand's consideration of the importance of us protecting of our life into the future. Our primary needs must thrive. Our primary sector, our natural environment must be protected, and the food that we also consume must be safe. With that in mind, MPI's new strategy provides focused need to make change or take opportunities with regards to advancing our vision. And our vision, New Zealand will be the most sustainable provider of high value food and primary products. For us to be able to provide high valued food and primary products, we should be able to also protect New Zealand from biosecurity risks, from food safety issues and risks that could also be introduced into New Zealand that would then hinder the vision or MPI's vision in providing that. Next slide, please. With MPI, we have MPI has 5 business units. We have the food safety component. We also have the fisheries, and we have the biosecurity in New Zealand. We also have our forestry service, and as well as our investment services. That is how we operate as a ministry, as a regulatory authority here in New Zealand. Next slide, please. So the component that I'll be presenting on, as I've alluded to earlier on, is on biosecurity. So it'll be around fresh produce, floriculture, cut flowers. So for those who have been exporting to New Zealand, they know and they understand this process. For those of us who are new and would like to also, would like to also in the future export to New Zealand, these are some of the processes that we follow. And the number one process is the request for an access for a particular commodity. For example, banana is sent by the exporting country, could be Samoa, could be Fiji, to New Zealand MPI. And there are two key words: prioritized and market-driven. And both these, I would say, principles, we have not really done well in the Pacific in terms of meeting these two principles. Most of the commodities that have been requested in the past have been requested to New Zealand MPI without any link to the market demand, without any link to how that commodity performs in the market. It is out of nowhere. In the past, maybe because of the political influence, a grower who may be related to someone in authority who then pursues that request, but then when the request was approved, trade has not resulted as a result of that. So having those requests to be prioritized, that is one of the key messages that we're pushing back to the country, for them to be able to have some sort of prioritization process, prioritize your commodities, and making sure that the prioritization also includes linking with the market, make sure that there is a market demand, make sure that there is a slot for the commodity at the market, and there are interested consumers who are interested for that commodity. It has to be market driven. So this is the shift. We're wanting to shift this approach. In the past as well, most of our growers, they go ahead and engage the whole village, and they plant a whole orchard of taro, maybe, or cassava. And then when it's mature, then they start running around looking for the market. By the time they secure the market, half of the crop is gone because of the cousins in the village. They come and they harvest, or pest and diseases, because it's maturing on the ground. So by the time you're ready to sell the produce, it's not the tonnage that you anticipated in the beginning to sell to the market. So it's a complete shift in prioritization and making sure that it's always market driven. We prioritize a request once that's received by MPI, and we have our prioritization process here in MPI. And once that's prioritized, then we proceed into the development of import health standards, and then trade can then commence once an IHS is approved or issued. Next slide. There have been recently some significant improvements into our import health development system. There are 4 that I have on the slide, but I'll just cover one which will be of importance to our discussions today, which is on the import health standards. We used to, in the past, issue import health standards based on a country commodity basis, and now we have moved to a much more generic or commodity basis. And I give you an example. In the past, if Tonga requests for, say, Tahitian limes this morning, and in the afternoon, Fiji requests for Tahitian limes as well, because they are the same commodity, but they are from 2 different countries. They will each be considered 2 different projects. And for each project you need resources. That's why in the past it took so long for us to actually issue import health standard, because of the approach that we used to take in the past, country commodity. But now, moving to a commodity generic approach, the same example, Tonga requested for Tahitian limes in the morning, and in the afternoon, Fiji, Tahitian limes as well, because they are the same commodity, irrespective of the country. The project will be one because of Tahitian limes. And then we do our analysis and assessment, and as countries become approved, as countries are assessed and they are given the okay, countries are then added to the list in the commodity IHS. So that is one of the changes, and that hopefully in terms of the benefits, we should be able to see the more quick processing of import oil standards in the future. Next slide, please. The next slide will be on the existing trade pathways into New Zealand. Most of us only know fresh produce. Yes, fresh produce is one of the pathways. We also have the frozen pathway. In the frozen pathway, we've realized that there has been a significant increase in the importation of frozen agricultural produce in the last 2, 3, or 4 years. Because, and this is also one of the recommendations we've always recommended to the countries, with fresh produce, there are biosecurity issues and concerns that you have to deal with. Whereas frozen pathway, the biosecurity risk is minimal or it's nil at all. So it's much safer to ship to New Zealand frozen agricultural commodities compared to the fresh produce. And we also have the floriculture, handicrafts, processed products is also another pathway whereby it's also increasing. And we also have containers. Even containers is a pathway. And I'm saying that purely from the biosecurity perspective in terms of how biological risks are introduced into New Zealand. And irrespective of the pathway, you have both biosecurity requirements as well as food safety requirements that needs to be met for those pathways to be complied with. Next slide, please. Now, this is where we are. This is the Pacific in terms of our fresh produce IHSs. So the numbers on the top, those are the number of fresh produce IHSs that are approved from those countries. So the highest is Fiji, and it's not only the highest for the Pacific, it's the highest for the whole world as well. In terms of fresh produce, the Pacific, we lead the other countries from the rest of the world in the number of IHSs that's been approved. But even though you see those numbers that are there, it doesn't mean that that country, they are exporting all those commodities, which goes back to what I've mentioned earlier on. In the past, the Pacific, we have not really organized ourselves well in terms of prioritizing our requests and making sure that the product that we are requesting has a spot in the market. It's market driven, and it's also based on prioritization process in the countries. So those are the countries, and those are the numbers of commodities approved from those respective countries. Next slide, please. Challenge to the Pacific. This is, and it needs to be mentioned at this point. In the past, everybody just thinks that biosecurity is the only a concern. There are only the biosecurity concerns that need to be taken into account. At the New Zealand border now, our clearance procedures, they cut across the supply chain management platform. And now, biosecurity, we also now have food safety systems in place. So that calls for a more holistic and a more coordinated approach in the exporting countries so that we are able to support the whole supply chain management. And I really like what was previously mentioned by Rohan. One of the things that we've realized as well in the past is that in addition to the lack of prioritization, getting the right information at the right time, well before you pick up your fork to go and dig your cassava mound to produce for the export market. It's getting the right information. Most of the investments and most of the projects have failed because we have not done the due process before we actually start, putting our plan into motion. Next slide, maybe. Won't go into detail because this is on the food safety slides, but this is for Mr. Damaivuna. So I've covered the biosecurity component of the presentation, and there are some established facts about some of the countries in the Pacific that will need to be further improved, maintained, and would need to be, there will need to be further investments of these are protected, especially with regards to the market here in New Zealand. Samoa, currently as we speak, we will be issuing the import health standards for citrus soon. Remember, we've moved away from a country commodity to now the generic, the big citrus IHS. Few of the Pacific countries will benefit from that. One of them is Samoa. While they have Tahitian limes that is currently approved, there will be other 7 species of citrus that are also included in this IHS that once approved. Samoa, you have 7 other species of citrus that you can also now export to New Zealand. And New Caledonia, they also have another fruit citrus species, the Mexican limes, that is now part of this new IHS. You already have your existing Tahitian limes, and the new will be Mexican limes. So you'll have Mexican limes added to that as well. And for Fiji, you also have 2 new access requests for citrus. You have Tahitian limes as well as male lemons. Tonga, you also have watermelon from Tonga that it's one of your priority commodities, and there has been a lot of improvement done in the pathway, and yeah, the pathway needs to be improved because it's one of your big commodity when it comes to export. And Fiji, likewise, you have few commodities that's only approved from Fiji and not from any other country in the world, like okra. Okra is not approved from any other country, and duruka as well. These are high value crops, of high value commodities in the market. Duruka is not imported from any other country, and there are other opportunities like pineapple. For our information, pineapple is the next IHS project that MPI will be working on, and there are already few Pacific Island countries that have submitted their request for new new IHS for pineapple. I'll stop here now, and through you, Madam Trade Commissioner, we could move on to the food safety presentation for Mr. Damaivuna. Thank you again.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much, Nazar. Always a pleasure to have you join us and impart your wisdom. Some very, very valuable concepts and information in your presentation. We'll come back to you after Alipate's presentation, because the questions that are arising, I think we could put to the both of you from MPI. So Alipate, welcome. Very pleased to have you join us this morning. And we look forward to hearing from you. So the floor is yours, Minaka.
Welcome, Madam Commissioner. Naganatha. Again, by way of introduction quickly, I am Alipate and I work in the Food Safety Division of MPI. In particular, I work in the approvals team, which, as the name suggests, is the approval or registration arm of the ministry, particularly when it comes to things associated with food safety. So in essence, my team registered all food businesses in collaboration with the local councils here in New Zealand. We are the sole registration authority for all animal products businesses, including all exporters of animal products and all importers of food. So I'll be covering the food safety aspect of importing food into New Zealand, and in particular in relation to how our food safety system is set up.
Alipate, if I may, I just sorry, it's Glenys here. So just for the benefit of the listeners, to point out that when we say food safety, we it's very inclusive, isn't it? Across all food products. So it relates to, so we just need to make this distinction.
Yep, that is correct. Yes, so that is all food for human consumption.
For human, whether it's irrespective of the manufacturer of the, so fresh, frozen, processed.
Yep. Everything that is intended for human consumption, that's what we're referring to when we talk about food safety.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alipati.
Thank you. So I'll start off with the law that established our food safety system. So there are effectively 3 tiers of the law that set up New Zealand's food safety system. And right at the top, you'll have our Food Act, which imposes a general obligation on anybody that trades in food to make sure that the food is safe and suitable. So that obligation applies to food importers as well. So the other part of the Food Act is for the purpose of facilitating trade. And under that, as you'll all be aware, we have obligations under various international agreements and treaties that we have to abide by when we're setting our importing rules. And under the Food Act, that's where the requirements for all food importers to be registered come from. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on. And then under the Food Act, you have the Food Regulations 2015. So that goes into a little bit more detail about certain things relating to import, in particular, how we categorize imported food depending on risk for the purpose of clearance at the border, and the verification frequencies for all food businesses and food importers. And then the third tier down, it gets more technical. That's when you talk about the food types that are subject to intervention at the border, where the importer will be required to provide evidence before the food safety officer can grant them with clearance. And then, of course, we have the Food Standards Code, which we share with Australia. So that particular code largely deals with the labeling requirements that Rohan talked about earlier on, and the compositional requirements for food. Now, if we jump onto the next slide, please. Then, of course, in addition to our domestic platform, we have our international obligations. You'd see there we have the SPS agreement. That one is very important to us when we're setting up importing rules, because of the principles under that agreement. We have to make sure that the importing rules that we put in place are science-based, and they are, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later on. They have to be proportional to the risks associated with the food. They have to be transparent, and the rules we set have to be non-discriminatory. As most of you may know, that we have the concept of most favored nation approach. It's effectively the approach that whatever rules you set for your most favored country, you must set it for the rest. And then, of course, in all situations, you have to be aiming towards equivalence. Effectively, the position that what is acceptable in one country is acceptable to us. But that's easier said than done, because most of the time things are not equivalent. That's why we carry on extra assessment and put in place extra intervention measures to make sure that food that is coming in is safe for our population. And as Nadar said earlier on, we also have the Codex standards there. So every time we set our food safety standards, whether that be in relation to food imports or any other general standard that we set, we always have Codex standard in mind. We can either, we have the ability to adopt specific standards if we want to, but most of the time we try and tailor our standards specifically to the risks profile of things that are coming in relation to New Zealand, and go from there. And then we have the Trans-Tasman Mutual Recognition Agreement. We have a very special relationship with Australia. So there, the principle under that agreement is effectively anything that is allowed to be legally sold in Australia can be sold here in New Zealand with minimal to no intervention, and vice versa. And then you have other bilateral agreements sitting underneath that. Next slide, please. So I'll start off with the question of who can import food into New Zealand. As Rohan touched on a little bit earlier, only registered importers can import food into New Zealand. It might be of interest to you to know that as of the 1st of August, we've done hard enforcement of this in collaboration with New Zealand Customs. So therefore, from that date, if a consignment is coming into New Zealand and the importer is not registered, and then that consignment will be held up until registration is achieved, and any associated cost with regards to the holding up of the consignment, it's transferred to a warehouse or storehouse to be stored in the meantime, or that associated costs with the holding up of the consignment will be borne by the importer. So please be aware of that and make sure that before you arrange for the importation of your product into New Zealand, that your import agent on this side is a registered importer. And also a person who is not a registered importer may use an agent who is registered. So that provision in our legislation is normally there for people like customs brokers who don't actually have ownership of the product, but they facilitate the clearance requirements. So they handle the customs clearance side of things. So if they are registered, then they can be used without the person using them having to be registered. And registration is done by MPI, in particular my team, and the registration process is done in collaboration with customs. So there are details on how this may be done, including the forms on the MPI website. So you have to go to customs first to get your customs client code, and after that they'll direct you to MPI with the appropriate application form, in which case your application will come through to my team, and then we'll process your application before approving it. There are, of course, criteria to importer registrations. There'll be, a check on your compliance history, a check on your character, just a general, effectively like a police clearance check to make sure there's nothing there that triggers an alarm with regards to whether you're appropriate. Looking at past convictions, if any, and things like that. Once all of that are cleared up, then we register a person as an importer. And once you're registered, there are duties under the Act for you to comply with. So this is more about the duties. So this includes, it's your responsibility to confirm the safety and the suitability of the food if you're an importer. This involves doing your due diligence and making sure that you have proper documentation from your supplier overseas. So when we check with the food importer over this side, we expect them to provide us with details about who they're sourcing it from, which country, what sort of safety mechanisms or considerations they've gone through, manufacturer's declarations where required. And those are the kind of documentation that they are expected to keep as part of their duties as an importer. We also place quite an emphasis on the ability to recall. So all food importers must have a recall procedure in place, and they must also test it to make sure that it's fit for purpose when it's needed. They can put it in action and prove that it's effective. There we go. So one of the challenges that we sort of consider right at the beginning is how do we decide which food we target at the border and which food we allow through without any intervention, because of the enormous volumes of food coming into New Zealand, because we're a trading country. You don't want to be checking absolutely everything. You want to be mindful of the fact that you have biosecurity checks with IHSs. Those are quite comprehensive. We don't want to be doubling up and duplicating the process, imposing costs and time to operators, as well as our own costs and time. So we want to simplify and streamline the process as much as possible. So to a larger degree, we sort of piggyback on the food safety side. We sort of piggyback on the biosecurity side of things. In most situations, the biosecurity requirements would be sufficient and food safety requirements won't be needed, but it's only in exceptional circumstances where there'd be extra food safety requirements for you to meet in terms of border clearance. So this slide here addresses how we categorize food in order to decide which one we target specifically at the border and which one can come straight through. So with our international obligation in mind, I talked about the principle of the SPS agreement before with regards to make sure that our requirements are science-based. So our legislation specifically say that we have to apply a science-based approach when we're making our categorization. So we have to give a due consideration to the risks to human health posed by the food in relation to its nature, the hazard associated with the food, the control measures that are applied during processing and handling of the food, the likelihood of the particular hazard being present in the food at a level determined as unacceptable in New Zealand according to New Zealand or international standard, and the likelihood that the food is not safe or suitable. So those are the considerations that we go through when we're categorizing the food. And these are the three general categories of food, which determines which one we test at the border coming in and which one we don't. So the very high risk food, we categorize them as high regulatory interest food or HRI food. These are foods, as the description shows there, they pose an increased risk to health of consumers and requires clearance for entry. And then next to that, you have increased regulatory interest food. Some countries, they call them surveillance food. These are high risk food where there's still a lot of question mark about them. So you want to keep them under surveillance, but you want to put in place controls to make sure that you are protecting the health of the public in terms of managing the risks at the border before entry is granted. And then the third category down, which are the low regulatory interest food, or LRI. So the overwhelming majority of food imported into New Zealand categorized as low regulatory interest food. And as I said before, only HRI and IRI foods require clearance at the border by a New Zealand food safety officer before it can be cleared into New Zealand. So currently, as I said, there are about 13 high regulatory interest foods and one increased regulatory interest food identified in the importing food notice, which is the notice available on the MPR website that sets out the different food types that requires a check at the border from a food safety perspective. And that check would be additional to any biosecurity check that might already be there. So the one increased regulatory interest food are frozen berries. That was been on that list since 2013, if I remember correctly, after an outbreak of hepatitis A in frozen berries imported from China and Thailand, if I remember correctly. So if you look at that particular notice, so for each one of those 13 high regulatory interest food, there you'd see the name of the food, the sort of hazard that we're concerned about, the type of check that is applied to them, and the sort of evidence that the importer will have to provide to the food safety officer to consider before the food can be released. So for bovine meat and meat products in particular, we check for BSE, peanuts and pistachio nuts, check for aflatoxins, frozen berries, as I said before, hepatitis A, raw milk products, Listeria mono and salmonella, and then when histamine for histamine susceptible fish and fish products. And as I said before, majority of food imported are low interest, so they come straight through. So one of the things that we do a lot of thinking about internally in MPI as well is what sort of evidence would be enough for the importer to provide us before we can grant clearance. So our general approach is to emphasize control where it's most effective to do so. To a larger degree, we want the risks to be managed where the food is produced or processed. So therefore, in pre-border before it comes to New Zealand. So we always want to push the focus back to where the food was produced in the home country, and do country approval. And then with regards to that, the output might be some sort of agreed certification, where we agree that we've checked your system and it is acceptable, and therefore we'll accept a official certificate from you that effectively confirm that the producer or processor was operating within the agreed scheme, and the product is indeed the outcome of that scheme. So therefore, once that certificate is provided, the product can come straight through. But for some countries, and also due to the nature of the product, that might not be practical, and sampling and testing might still be required, where the foods arrive at the border and it's sampled and tested for the specific hazards that I mentioned before. And the result of that, the result of the testing will decide whether the product is released into New Zealand or not. And then also we have the New Zealand Importer Assurance or Trusted Importer System. So this is for importers with good compliance history. So after a consecutive test of the food that they're bringing into the country, if they're bringing in the same thing and they provide really good, consistent level of compliance, and they can skip tests for certain periods of time.
Alipate, sorry,
Yep.
it's Glenn here. I'm just conscious of the time, and I'm just wondering whether it would be possible for you to go through the slides in the next few minutes to conclude, because I can see some really valuable questions coming through.
Yep.
And
All right. Yeah, we can skip this slide over here. Thank you.
okay.
Integration into domestic system. Yes, this one is simple. So once the food is imported into New Zealand, then it's transitioned into the New Zealand domestic system and managed from there. So every food business in New Zealand, they are registered with either MPI or the council, and they all operate under the HACCP-based risk management program. So once the food is imported into New Zealand and the New Zealand business gets it, they manage it according to that HACCP-based program. Yep. So we make sure that food importers can be subject to verification. So there are effectively two categories of importers here. So you have importers that also sell food in New Zealand. So they all belong in that category that I explained before. They'll already be operating under a HACCP-based risk management system in New Zealand. So their verification will just be the normal verification that they're subject to under that system. And then you have importers that only import but don't sell here. For example, customs brokers. For those guys, they are not subject to any verification, but they can be required to be verified if there are compliance issues. Yep. So these types of regulated people are required to be approved or recognized by MPI. So first of all food safety officers that carry out food clearance at the border or clearing consignments, they have to be approved by MPI first. All recognized verification agencies and persons who carry out verification, they have to be recognized by MPI before they can do that. And also all laboratories that carry out tests for regulatory purposes, we approve them as well. And we have this big safety net called a monitoring program. So our law allows MPI to set up monitoring programs to monitor how the food safety system is functioning. If we're concerned about a particular food product imported or produced domestically, we can put in place a monitoring program to go and require producers to provide samples so we can test them for certain hazards if we're concerned about those things. So we can do that. One example that I put there was the Fukushima example, the nuclear leak in Japan. So you see there was a monitoring program put in place to test fish species from around the New Zealand coast, some samples of fish from New Zealand supermarket, and some sample of imported fish from Japan and fish caught in the Northern Pacific region. So yeah, so effectively the outcome of that program was that our testing revealed there was no risk to the New Zealand consumers. Mm-hmm. Yep, and that's effectively this diagram here sort of sums up what I was talking about before. You have to be registered as an importer, comply with your duty, be aware of the category in which your food falls into, because that will determine whether they are targeted at the border here or not. Remember that from the 1st of August, we've put in hard enforcement. If the consignment is not being imported by a person who is registered, it will be held up. And then, as I've explained, we have different evidence that we require importers to provide for different high regulatory interest food or increased regulatory interest food that they're bringing into the country. Yep, that's me. Thank you. That concludes my presentation today.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Alipate, and thank you, Natha. While I have you, I think it would be useful at this point to just put to you some of the questions that are coming through, if you don't mind. So one of them is around registered importers, and I heard this phrase being repeated through your presentations. Does this, having the importance of having registered importers or registered agents recognized by MPI, does this apply for food coming into the formal market and informal market, or just into the formal market? Now, the question is coming from the standpoint that, as we know, here in New Zealand, a lot of exports from the Pacific Island countries are targeting the diaspora, here in Auckland and across New Zealand. And so I guess the question is in relation to that. So does it apply?
It depends on the purpose or for which the food is being imported. If it's imported for the purpose of sale, then the importer must be registered.
So even to clear it at the border, let's just break that up a little bit. So for the informal market, we notice that a lot of the containers that are coming in for the informal market are purely for consumption, and some of it is for sale. So we do know that communities resell it. So what happens in that case?
If it's going to be sold, like including reselling the food, then the importer needs to be registered. Yeah.
Okay.
So prior to the 1st of August, it was sort of like a bit of a lax in terms of enforcement. But from the 1st of August, a policy decision was made that we're going to enforce the registration requirement where every food consignment imported for sale into New Zealand, the importer has to be registered. Otherwise, it'll be held up.
All right. Can you just please, Alipate, go to your slide that highlighted the 3 risks, or the 3 types of risks?
Categories of food.
Yes. Put up on the screen, Ivy, please.
Just while she's putting that up, right now as we speak, we've got about 3,138 registered importers that have registered with us so far.
Okay. Ivy, are you there? Can you just put Alipate's presentation back on the screen, particularly the slide that talks about the risks? And while Ivy's doing that, the question that's come through is, looking at those risks and the classification of those risks, as you pointed out, Alipate, and taking into account Nava's presentation where he highlighted the number of approved assessed commodities across the Pacific Island countries, and there was a scale of those numbers. So you have on one hand a list of approved commodities from Pacific Island countries, and then you have on another hand the so-called risk assessment, the risk assessment that your department applies. How then do you put the layer of the Pacific layer over this application of clearance? So the clearance processes, how do you put a Pacific lens on that, noting that this is a generic and applies to every single global importer into New Zealand? I'm just kind of bringing it down to the Pacific context and wondering how it applies, or where you seeing that conversion, for Pacific products coming in.
Okay.
So the question is to both Alipate and Nava.
Okay.
Brilliant.
So from our perspective, not all type of imported food would require a risk assessment. So we look at NAFA's side for each type of food being imported into New Zealand. If we are satisfied that everything is being addressed there, we won't require any further risk assessment most of the time. So the only sort of food types that we've imposed extra requirements on were those 13 specific food types that we've listed on the on our importing food notice that is available on the MPI website. Yeah, so those are the only ones that are extra to the biosecurity side of things from NAVA's side. Yeah. So most of those fresh produce stuff, there is no requirement on the food safety side of things. Just from the biosecurity side. Yeah. So on the food safety side, if you look in there, it's just mainly beef, raw milk. You have nuts and fish susceptible to histamine and frozen berries. Yeah, mainly along that category.
Okay. So again, when you put a Pacific lens on that, what you just said, a lot of what's coming in from the Pacific is you got fish and your frozen and fresh produce, right? So it's important to make those distinctions. And the other question that has come through is we talked a lot about in both your presentations around the food imports and the security measures that are necessary. What about for non-food products? And probably Nava, this question is directed to you. There's a question specific to garments. I know this is probably outside of the presentation, but while we have you, Nava, online, maybe you could offer some words of wisdom as to those small businesses in the Pacific whose manufacturing and exports are garment centric, not food.
Thank you, Trade Commissioner. With garments, we go through a profiling at the border. Okay. So our target evaluators, they are the ones who do the evaluation. Even though garment can be considered a non-agricultural item, but if there are reasons that would justify for us to inspect a consignment, then we will do that. Now we also need to know that we have it's called the joint border arrangement. If a consignment is considered non-agricultural, but is being inspected by customs, and then during the inspection they pick up that there is a pest that was detected on the consignment, so they are also they have that we have that arrangement that they will have to close the container and make that reference to us. So some of those commodities, some of those items that are not considered agricultural commodities that that are being picked up by customs. So I think in terms of advice with those with regards to those non-agricultural commodities, some of the exporters, they have what is called they have their own treatment system. For example, like garments, maybe they pack their garments and then maybe treat the container just before they sail with methyl bromide to ensure that they kill any pest that's there in the container, because they can be packed in, maybe at the back of the house or wherever they will be packed. That does not stop the pest from entering the container, the hitchhikers. But having those systems in place, like a treatment protocol, would help to manage those. Otherwise, they can be picked up at the border, not necessarily by us, can be picked up by customs or other officers who will be there, like security, who can also pick that up for us.
I think that's very, very, very clear. We have quite a few questions to you both, but I'll think it might be best that we address them at the end of the day, noting that we have two more presenters lined up and waiting to come into the room. But just the last question on the focal point. So what would be your advice to those listening as to who their focal points are in country? Who should they go to at the national level to access and to seek more information or advice on the points that you've raised around food security and biosecurity.
Thank you, Trade Commissioner. You've raised a very important point. The focal point for biosecurity in the countries are the biosecurity head office. So the head of biosecurity in the countries, they are our focal point. So every discussion that we have with the countries is done through the focal point. So we cannot engage with anyone else in the country, but through the focal point. And that's where every interested trader, that's where they get the information from. Put it this way, we are New Zealand, we are the regulatory authority in New Zealand. We cannot be in Samoa, we cannot be in Fiji to make sure that our requirements are met. So that's why we have the biosecurity authorities in those countries. They are our equivalent. And when it comes to facilitating trade for export to New Zealand, for example, they are there to ensure that our requirements, that's when they put the New Zealand cap on and make sure that our requirements are actually met. This is a very important point. And just to add on to that, Trade Commissioner, the discussions we've been having today, as I've mentioned, there's a shift as well. Like in the past, traders are only interested about biosecurity requirements. No, now you need to find out what's the biosecurity requirement, what is also the food safety requirements. Some commodities are approved under the biosecurity discipline, but they have issues with regards to the food safety. A good example is fresh mussels from Fiji or from anywhere. Fresh kai, we can approve that. It's approved under the biosecurity system, but under the food safety system, they have concerns on that. So I think they're just reiterating the point, Trade Commissioner. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Nanda. And I'm sorry we're running into against time. I wish we had more time this afternoon to keep you online because the questions are coming through, and I think the listeners will agree that this is a really critical area to exporters, and they really need to understand what it is that they're dealing with if they're trying to get their exports or their products into New Zealand. So I'm going to just ask you to stay online for a little bit more, if you don't mind, as we line up two more presenters who are time bound. I do apologize to Anthony and Jay, but I will take this opportunity to again thank you, Nada. Thank you, Alepate. Please stay online, and we'll come back to you at the end of the day. Naka. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll move on. Our next presenter is Anthony Akoi, representing the Kelton Group of companies from Fiji. Anthony will talk about the company's journey towards HACCP certification. I know this topic has come up in previous presentations. And we thought it would be useful to hear from a company who went through this journey to share with us their learnings. Kelton Group is represented, as I said, by Anthony, apologies. Anthony Akoi is the Managing Director of Kelton Group of Companies, and we're very pleased to have you on board, Anthony. So thank you, and the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes. Naka.
Okay, thank you, Glenys. Thank you, Rohan and team, and Buluvanaki, everybody. Just a bit of an overview. There's a lot of material to cover off in 10 minutes, so we'll do our best to see how we go. The first 3 slides will be just on the operation itself, and perhaps some of the lessons that we've learned from trying to farm and export to New Zealand. The last 3 slides will be on the biosecurity side of things. Small point of correction, we haven't actually achieved HACCP certification yet. We're still on the basic biosecurity certification, which allows us to supply the informal market in New Zealand. But more on that as we go through. So very briefly, today, there's 2 of us that will present. Myself, obviously, as Glenys has explained, I run Kelton Group. We also have Ratusuli Tawake, who's currently our GM out on the farm. And his prior role was Deputy CEO of Biosecurity Fiji prior to joining us. Kelton, very quickly, Kelton's a private family investment group. We've been operating for over 50 years now. fairly wide range of business investments, from trading, property, which is our mainstay, which is how we acquired our farm, technology, computers, one of the pioneers in computing across the Pacific. So that's probably what we've, aside from property, what we're known for. Manufacturing, construction, aviation, tourism, insurance, and our agricultural business, commercial farming. Today, there are only two areas that we operate in, that is property and commercial agriculture. So that kind of gives you a bit of an indication about what we think about this opportunity. I've put a link on the slide for our website, and in particular our farming property. And that is the Kelton Estate. Kelton Estate is a property that's owned by our group. It's a 2,700 acre farm just outside of Suva in Nauru, on the Suva side of the Nauru Bridge. What we're trying to do there is develop a vertically integrated farming operation, where we do the farming, we do the food processing, and we do the export and distribution. Our Tuika is our export brand, and at the moment we've just chosen to focus solely on frozen taro and cassava, and just very, very illuminating for me to listen to some of the prior presentations, because it appears that we've actually taken the shortcut quite fortuitously in selecting frozen products and picking a fairly basic product set to work with. We have an Auckland operation, a small distribution team based in Auckland that addresses our customer set there. In our journey, we've had to come to grips with the whole idea of commercial farming, which really isn't practiced well in Fiji, aside from the likes of Grace Roads Foods, who are a Korean organization that's come in and really shown everyone how to go about the process.
Anthony, sorry, it's Glenys here. I'm so sorry to butt in, but we can't, your slides on the screen is not quite visible. I just wondered whether you could please change the appearance so that we are seeing one slide at a time.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yes.
You seeing both, or?
Yes, we're seeing both.
Okay. So let me. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
And then could you go to the function?
Yeah. Let me just minimize that. Okay.
Yes. Much better.
Okay. Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Perfect. Right. So introduction of innovations and technology at every stage of the process. That's from the farming operation itself through to factory processing, and then obviously the export. For marketing and branding, we've found that it's quite important for us to try and develop a relationship directly with the market. So we have a website, and we also use social media, Facebook and Instagram. And I've put a link down the bottom to our website address. If you go there, you can kind of see the things that we're trying to attempt in relation to educating the markets that we're targeting in terms of how our product looks, and also how to prepare our product for consumption. To date, we've done 33 containers to New Zealand. I would have to say that we're still learning, as crazy as that sounds. We should be quite a bit further down the track, but it's a process that's not an easy one. And I totally echo Alo's comments earlier about some of the difficulties that people getting into this area of commercial agriculture face, and ourselves being one. We have, however, gone through the processes, all of the processes that are required. We've even gone as far as getting a Woolworths Countdown Supermarkets approval. So if you can imagine some of the discussions around GS1 and packaging requirements, et cetera, those goals have been kicked and ticked off for us. And prior to our current packing operation, we used to work with the government factory AMA, who are HACCP certified. That was the mechanism through which we were able to access Countdown supermarkets. Our current certifications are obviously biosecurity approval in the factory that we are operating at the moment. It's a Fiji product, Fiji grown, so those are fairly standard certifications. We do hope to get certified, audited and certified for organic production, which we do anyway. We use completely organic methods. We don't use pesticides, we don't use herbicides on our farm, and everything's done mechanically with machinery. ISO certifications, that's another step, both for the farm and the factory. HACCP, of course, which will open up tier 1 in Australia and New Zealand, and also the US market, which I think is the big opportunity for Fiji agricultural exports. Carbon zero, that's another thing that we're fortunate enough to have half the property covered in a rainforest. So there's an opportunity there for us to get that audited and added to our list of qualifications. Fair trade, we do work with a network of outgrowers, and wherever we endeavor to pay, we track market pricing right back to the farm gate at the outgrower level and ensure that our outgrower network actually gets a fair shake in terms of the money they get for their products. Just very quickly, some of the lessons that we've learned, and again, I'm very conscious about time. As I touched on, there's a huge difference between subsistence farming and commercial farming in Fiji. I would say that 99% of the operations in Fiji are doing subsistence farming. And the actual process of doing commercial farming is quite different to how what people understand to be farming in Fiji. Again, as Arlo had pointed out earlier, you must be well capitalized before you start. Otherwise, you wind up spending the same money plugging holes and leaking unnecessary operating costs that you could have spent just getting the right machinery and doing it properly from the start. So that's actually really important to have a plan, have a sufficient amount of capital before you start and actually work the plan. The third point is one that a number of the prior presenters have raised. You must find your customer and your market before you start planting. It's too late because you're dealing with perishable commodities. It's too late when you are ready to harvest and you run around and try and find how to sell the product. You're guaranteed you'll lose money. Fourth point, get good advice. This is very important for farming new entrants into the market. Generally, it takes many, many years of operating to acquire the knowledge that you need to be successful on your own farm. And each farm is quite different to, for example, planting dalo on our farm, and the cassava is quite different to dalo and cassava planted on somebody in the Singatoka Valley or in the Lomai Vuna or some other place on BT level. The products might be the same, but the methods and how you go about it really is quite specific to the land itself. Point 5, you must invest in the right machinery and equipment. I think Arlo touched on this as well. Again, commercial farming is, as I say, is quite different to subsistence farming. When you scale, and if you want to provide the kind of consistency of quantity of supply and pricing that's required to make this a sustainable business, you must have the right gear and the right plan from the outset. Point 6, again, the same sort of point, different flavor. The farm setup is important, and you've got to do it before you start. You've got to work out your beds, you've got to dig your drains, you've got to work out your irrigation, you must work out your workflows. All of those things need to be done beforehand. Point 7, as you go through the crop cycle, consult MPI in your local country. Let them educate you on what the processes and the protocols that are required for growing the crop successfully, what those are, and implement. That's what they're there for. Use them. Generally, they're free. And again, it goes back to getting the good advice. But as you go, evolve your method. Sometimes they may not be, right up to the mark in terms of some of the advice they dispense, and you might find in your experience that your journey is a little bit different to how they say. So don't be afraid to sort of adjust as you go forward. Number 8, bed preparation, bed maintenance, absolutely critical. We found you've got to, you can't sort of plant and then try and do your bed preparation afterwards, as most Fiji farmers tend to try and do. You must do your bed preparation beforehand, like Kiwi farmers do. And maintaining the beds, weeding, particularly up here in the Pacific, is really important because everything just grows out of control, and you must pay attention to that part. Otherwise, your yield will wind up being substandard. Product presentation, that's important. Packaging, you've got to pay attention to the details there. Your graphic design, packaging quality, the durability in when you ship in the containers, and how it's handled in the supermarket. All of those things are actually areas that you have to invest in to get your product right. The packaging is actually a part of the whole product itself. So sometimes people sort of think about the contents, they don't really, and it's an easy mistake to make. They don't really actually think about the look of the packaging, but it's probably, I would say, as important as the product itself, the quality of the product itself. Product presentation, the internet, I think that's first point of call for a lot of the consumers. And if you want to establish your brand, you must be able to build like a B2C type relationship with your consumer, even though there may be 3 or 4 other third parties in the supply chain before your consumer handles your product. You've still got to, and leaving that part to somebody else to do for you is, we think, is a mistake. You've got to actually try to invest there. Point 10, keeping prices and supply volumes stable and predictable. This is quite important. Some of the comments that I heard earlier when we started our journey is that, suppliers in Fiji are famous for sampling. So they can produce wonderful samples, but when you ask them for a container a month, or 2 containers a month, or 10 containers a month, there's silence, because no one's kind of worked out how to sort of backfill and do the hard yards to make sure that the consistency of supply, and therefore the pricing is stable right across the board. There is also a little bit of a market issue here with, I know a lot of our contemporaries in agriculture in Fiji, exporters, they face situations where the middlemen tend to sort of dominate in terms of price structuring and that. There are, in mature supply chains, there are definite margins, in terms of fresh produce and cold chain supply, which are there. And unfortunately, finding those channels aren't necessarily easy for small suppliers. And what tends to happen is they wind up with somebody who knows somebody, and then that guy thinks he can put 100% on the product, if he imports it. And then the whole thing kind of goes sideways, because the product ends up at market too expensive, and it's just not what the consumer wants. And lastly,
Hi, Johnny. We're going to have to move along here. I just got a message that the next presenter has to leave shortly. So if you wouldn't mind just taking us through the remainder.
Okay, all right. So I'll skip through that. So I'll turn over now to Ratusuli, who will just do the last 3 slides.
Okay, Vinaka, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just go very briefly, or maybe I just jump to the second slide.
Yeah, okay, sure.
Yeah.
Just okay, right. There we go.
I just go directly to the some of the requirements by biosecurity in establishing a pack house. A suitable site is very important. We need to actually select a suitable site, and then it must be accessible at all times to all vehicles, especially the container trucks. And then we must actually adhere to the floor plan of biosecurity for Fiji, because it includes actually the proper drainage system. And then we need to have enough adequate space in the pack house to allow people to move around freely. And then there should be physical separation between all operational points. We have an unloading zone, we have a cleaning, peeling zone, and we have processing zone, packing zone, and then we have a storage zone, and also loading zone for export. And the floor must be concrete and proper drainage system in place, and also a proper waste management control system in place. Must have a ceiling to prevent dust accumulation, easy to clean. And then it should be designed to prevent pests and other contamination entering into the house. And then we should have a proper ventilation and general hygiene system in place. Biosecurity sanitation requirement must be met. And then we should have a very important inspection and quality control room, separate from the storage room. And there are other sanitation areas, like we need to have a small kitchen, a place where the staff can have their meal, a proper area for staff to to have a shower change, and should have adequate water supply, and also a water heating system in place. Can get another the last.
Okay.
Yeah. These are some of the requirements for you to able to export the container. As soon as the container is actually closed, you need to provide a commercial invoice. That is the first thing. Then we have a bill of lading provided by the shipping company, a phytosanitary certificate by Secretariat of Fiji for frozen export in Fiji. It's minus 18 degrees for 7 days before the container is able to be exported. And then we should have a packing list, which actually shows all the packages in the container. And then we have a temperature declaration for frozen exports, which is monitored by Security Authority of Fiji, and then a packing declaration. So these are some of the important documentations that needs to be provided before we can export the container and allow the container to be freed at the imported destination.
Okay, so thank you. That was basically all we had prepared for the session today. Trade Commission.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Kelton. Thank you to Anthony and your co-presenter. Some very, very important lessons learned, and thank you for sharing the journey of your company. To those listening in and registered here with us this afternoon, I'm sure Anthony and his colleagues at Kelton would be happy to answer your questions offline. And we will be sharing Anthony's presentation along with the other presentations later on today. Again, thank you, Anthony. Appreciate your time. Always lovely to have you join us on these sessions, and we'll come back to you with the questions that are posed specifically to your presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, we move on now with the presentation, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our next presenter. Jay Patel is the Managing Director of Ashen Ventures New Zealand. Welcome, Jay.
Thank you, Glenys.
Ethos are based on delivering high quality consumer goods to customers in New Zealand in the quest for value for money. They started out targeting the Polynesian consumers and later extended their reach to a broader consumer base through various channels of distribution. We'll hear more from Jay about their company here in New Zealand and what they can do for you and some of the lessons they learned. So over to you, Jay, and again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to present a brief on the New Zealand market for those who are looking at coming into this market. Just a brief background very quickly about Asian Ventures. Is part of a business from Fiji, from the Ashabai group of companies, which has been involved in FMCG, manufacturing, and obviously distribution. And what we've learned from the past, that has been applied into New Zealand market. So effectively, when Asian Ventures started in New Zealand in 1989, the first thing that we looked at was introducing products that we were familiar with from the Pacific. And it, as Gladys mentioned, that night was from the Polynesian products that we started off the business. Could we just move on to the next slide, please? So the business started off with core products being coconut cream, mackerel, cabin bread as a starter. Entering into the markets, who our channels are in New Zealand is basically your major supermarket chains that we deal with, your fruit and veggie stores, and the likes of hospitality. Sorry, I've just skipped a bit early on, but no, in terms of Ashon is importing products globally from Fiji, Australia, Southeast Asia, China, India, Turkey, and South Africa, and so on. It has got a sister company as well called Tahi Pacific, which exports products from New Zealand into the Pacific, and another distribution arm that does liquor. We just move on to the next slide, please. The brands that we represent in the market over here that was developed are Pacific Crown, Taste of India, FMF, which came on board recently, Kitchens of India, Ching's, and Sol Tuna, which is of recent that we've started, Solace Choice. These are the brands that now have received good following after getting listing in the supermarkets. Now, the question of getting products listed in the supermarkets. Could we just quickly move on to the next slide? Now, in terms of channels that now we service, there are the major supermarket groups in New Zealand, which is the likes of Pack and Save, New Worlds, Four Squares, Countdown, Fresh Choice, Super Values, and in the food service area, Gilmore's, Bid Foods, and the likes. Getting products listed is what is quite important for somebody who's looking at getting into the market. And dealing with the supermarket, obviously, what are they looking for? First thing they would always question is, what is the consumer looking for? And how, as a supplier, we will meet the requirements. Typically, the stores are looking for quality products, supply, they're looking for margins. All these aspects need to be identified well ahead before actually looking at entering in the market. Currently, the supermarkets are looking for products that are unique. They have got some point in difference, which the consumers are looking for more towards the likes of vegan or they are organic. Replacement for meat is something that is growing in the market currently in New Zealand, which is plant-based. So as an exporter, I think it's quite important, whichever company they're looking at working with, they need to understand the requirements of what the actual market is looking for. The margin structure is quite important. But prior to coming to that, I think it's very important that now the exporter needs to be very mindful of the fact that now they are able to produce the quality required, the volumes that may be required, and meeting the price points and promotional activity for those products. And these aspects need to be looked well ahead before venturing into looking at exporting any products into the New Zealand market. These things can be looked at working very closely with the company that the exporter is looking for working through. And currently, we see there's an opportunity for the Pacific Island countries to export their products into New Zealand more so than the traditional markets where the products are currently coming from in terms of Asia, where there's a demand, supply, lack of availability of equipment or packaging material and things like that. And the major factor being the cost of freight. This is one advantage that Pacific would currently have in the market for gaining entry into New Zealand. Cost of freight has become a major element for the business and businesses. So coming back to the products, very important to have good quality product, consistent quality, and consistency in terms of pricing being offered. What we present as an importer and distributor to our customers is that no, we have built a trust with our customers over the past 25 years of running the distribution business in New Zealand. The new facility that we've recently built is to bring in the efficiency and bringing to market those products that now are looked for by the supermarkets, have actually seen that now we are meeting their requirements. So the important part is that now what we say we deliver. So that at this point in time, the service level is quite prime important. So pricing may not be a major issue. So could you go to next slide, please? So Asian Ventures currently has got a facility that can store up to 8,000 pallets, of which around 1,500 pallets is frozen, and the balance being in ambient. And what the company currently does is basically runs a warehouse management system, which brings in all the efficiencies that's required for the business to operate and be in front of your major players in the market, as I'd mentioned earlier on, the two supermarket chains, Foodstuffs and Countdown, being the major players in this market. Having a good relationship is quite important in this market. It's a very, very important aspect that now there needs to be a regular contact with the category buyers at the supermarket level, and always being in contact and seeing what they're looking for and what we are able to procure for them. That relationship does help long term in terms of ranging the products. So what's involved in terms of ranging a product? Typically in a supermarket, they have reviews, category reviews, and these are done on a yearly basis. Sometimes they have a minor review as well. And there's a process that takes place. Basically, when a review takes place of a category, the category manager will look at what is selling and what is not selling in the marketplace and make a decision based on what needs to be on the shelf and what needs to go. Currently, all the supermarkets are now looking at using and actually are using consumer data and their buying behavior, and using Dun Humphreys being one of the companies that now gives you an insight of the consumer, of their buying habits. So they're looking at the real estate of what they're turning, what their return on investment is on the shelf. So in relation to that, it's quite important that firstly, the demands for the consumer, what they're looking for is met. Innovative product, quality, and it's meeting the price expectation. As a supplier, it's important that now we meet all these requirements along with what promotional activity can take place in getting the product to become successful. Classic example has been, Asian Ventures has been quite, has worked to get a brand of simmer sauces quite successful in the marketplace, but by investing into the market through sampling, offering the right price point, and continued sort of now being in front of the consumer by advertising in the likes of magazines, or now with digital marketing. And those are the aspects that now needs to be done at an ongoing basis, because these are the things that the supermarkets are looking for, that know what are you actually doing for your product, how you bring it in front of your consumer, how can they recall the branding. All these aspects are also quite important. This is basically in a nutshell that know what we are doing as a business. So we are open to looking at exporters out of the Pacific who are looking to gain entry into this market. We've got a lovely big facility, and we've got obviously the network already established for a range of categories that we are in, and it's expanding. Frozen products is obviously a new category that we've started. So opportunities for agro-based products is quite good, and I feel that now we could look at now suppliers would be keen to talk to if got suppliers of the areas. I heard early on that now the likes of okra in Fiji, there's an opportunity there. Obviously now your frozen taro and cassava is one of the big exports. Daruka, as was mentioned, would definitely be another product that has got a good opportunity. If we can just move on to the next slide, please. Right. Sorry, this has been a bit of a rushed sort of presentation, but maybe if anyone has got any questions they would like to get answered, Lennis.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jay. And my team and I had the pleasure of visiting your factory. I think it was earlier this year or last year. Our time has flown. And we were not pleasantly, but we were really, really impressed by your operations out there. And you could see quite clearly the level of investment that Ashen has put into building a new facility. You certainly are one of the leaders in the market. And just on your presentation, I wondered whether, Jay, you could just spend a little bit more time talking about that whole ecosystem around ranging of products, because from the presentations this morning, I think it's important to share and instill in the minds of SMEs and exporters that yes, there is a process and certification. We heard those presentations and those key messages from MPI and food safety. We heard from Rohan and Alo this morning how important it is to get your priorities right and your checklists in place and take those steps to knowing what to do in what order. But from your side, where you're actually in the market, you're interfacing, as you said, with buyers, and you've listed them, those companies that Ashen deals with. Could you just kind of spend a little bit more time explaining how that whole ecosystem works, getting product to market? You talked about the ranging of products and that whole review process that buyers go through.
And so typically what the supermarkets look at is obviously they've got their own private label. Then obviously you've got now maybe one or two market leaders or second and third brand that are there in the market that now obviously support the product. They are forever looking for their return on investment on the shelf, as I said earlier on. So what are the consumers looking for? So the process of review is quite important. Whenever they're having a review of any category, they go through everything in sync by product line and SKU in terms of what is giving the best returns. And bearing in mind what the consumer is looking for and what innovations it's coming through. And in trying to attain that, obviously they look at a lot of data, not only from New Zealand and Australia, probably globally, to see where the trends are taking place. And decisions are based on where everything's heading. So the process is very simple. During the review process, they will look at the market size. Obviously, they currently what both retailers are looking at is increasing their private label business. Obviously, it's in their own interest. Typically, if you look at UK, the private label business is worth probably 34% of what their sales are, whereas in New Zealand, it's very low base. It's currently sitting around probably around 11%, 12%, but it's growing at a very small rate, because your players in the market, the market leaders, they're quite strong in terms of their branding. I would give you a good example of Seaload as being one of the companies that's involved in canned tuna and fish category. Supermarkets get rebates. They give the opportunity to do the planogram for the supermarket because they are so strong and control over 65% of the market. So those are sitting in that sort of level. I mean, obviously, no, it will be very difficult to shift. But if you're looking at a low base category that's worth probably $6 or $7 million, you have a chance of actually making a dent in that and attaining a good growth and share, provided you have the product that is all natural. It's meeting the requirements for the palate, for the consumers, and the pricing is right, and you're promoting it properly. So the listing process, obviously, as I mentioned early on, that no review takes place, and they take into account all these aspects to see, because the supermarket shelf has got only so much space. So they decide on what to cull back on, what's turning over enough for them. So they have a requirement. Is it giving me 5 units per product per store per week? The different categories got different sort of requirements. So that's what the supermarkets actually look at. Would that be something that now, Gladys, that you or the listeners would want to?
Yes, absolutely. And I guess, does the same apply to fresh and frozen things sitting in the supermarket from the Pacific?
More so, fresh and frozen would be in the same scenario, but no, probably similar, I would say. But because it's fresh produce, the supply chain is quite an important aspect, because that's where everything sort of now needs to be well planned, because fresh produce you can't keep for very long.
Indeed.
So there needs to be a constant check on what the movement is. And henceforth, that's the very reason that now supermarkets have got selected people that they are well versed with the type of products they're dealing with. So if we're talking about root crops, they have a very good idea of what the movement is, where the population base is, where the consumption is. And it's not, the listing takes place based on the demographics. And if you've got a market for, say, taro or cassava, and you're saying, okay, Porirua, for example, in Wellington, there's a market for that, or Mangere in Auckland, you might say. So now where there's a use, you've got seasonal workers coming into New Zealand working in the orchards. So it could be Hastings or Palmy, or it could be even Nelson and Blenheim, because this is all relative to the seasons. That could be one of the aspects that no one needs to understand. Similarly, for your frozen products, if you're talking about frozen taro and cassava, there's more market. The market is more for the fresh rather than frozen. But if you are having issues with logistics and manning that, so now the next best option is to go frozen. But obviously there's a cost element involved. Anything that you're dealing with frozen products, there's a cost to it, and getting products around is not cheap. So there'll be a lot of work involved in that area.
Yeah. It sounds, Jay, that it sounds to me from your explanation that the process is quite competitive, isn't it? So competitive in the sense that you have, when supermarkets make the decision as to which product to take off the shelf and replace it with, and in that replacement product could be from the Pacific, whether it's chili oil or chili sauce or corned beef or salt tuna, for example. It's a competitive process, isn't it?
Very much so.
Right? So in the minds of exporters, isn't that an important point for them to consider? That when they're looking to the New Zealand market, any segment of the market, they need to take into consideration or know that to get their product into a supermarket or wherever the case may be, they're competing with someone else, another supplier in the same category, right?
Definitely. They're competing with another supplier. So now, obviously, now what happens is that now, if we're talking about now root crops, for example, in frozen, I mean, the products are also coming from Asia, and you're competing with Asian products. I touched very briefly on the freight cost. I mean, at this point in time, I believe that the freight cost is probably cheaper to send from Fiji to New Zealand as opposed to Asia. So the opportunities for frozen, from frozen perspective, it's probably an opportunity there. But yeah.
Thank you very much, Jay. I'm going to ask now all of the presenters to, would you mind please switching your videos on as we go through the questions, and I direct the questions to you. So Alapate and Nava, Rohan, Alo, if you're still online. Thank you, Anthony. If you could switch your videos on, and let's see your pretty faces. Yes. Alo, Vinaka. Okay. So some very, very interesting and very, very useful guidelines and recommendations and suggestions, and very, very good and very, very useful recommendations that have come through in the presentations this morning. I'm going to spend a few more minutes now, if you allow me, to pull out some of the questions and direct them to the respective presenters. So just bear with me, please, if you don't mind. And the first question is for, I'm going to start down the bottom, for Mr. Arkoi. Okay, here you go, Anthony. For the market you are exporting to, what are some other products that you are currently not exporting, but are considering venturing into? For instance, herbal medicines and tonics, such as lila, turmeric, warusu, I think I've got warusi, has become increasingly popular and in demand here in Fiji. And I think there's also a market for it overseas, also in Tukai limited to frozen goods only. I hope I'm answering the question correctly. So Tony, you have a couple of minutes.
Okay, thank you for that. We've deliberately kept the product set quite narrow. At this point, I have to say the comment that we're only really just scratching the surface of developing the farm. So we've probably got about 70 acres under crop at this point. We've tried everything on the farm. Everything kind of works, but the process of getting a product to market, and as Jay has pointed out, you really are competing against the best of the best in New Zealand. So you've got to get it absolutely right. And if you want to play in the big leagues, you are having to put on the, put in the ship or in the freezer container a world-class product. And that's, so we've deliberately kept it narrow. We haven't really entertained even other root crops like cassava, like kumala, or although we've tried it on the farm. We will eventually get to it. But at this point, our focus really is on just getting this product, this basic product right, and then getting our outgrower network, adopting some of the technology, some of the techniques, so that they also get their supplies right and are able to meet that standard that's required by the market. You know, this is, you know, it requires a lot of discipline and control.
Yep, understandably so. Thanks, Anthony, for that. And the next question is for Jay. So for Ashen, do you have an entry type of deal for a green exporter, then grow to an optimum point? And the second question is, you mentioned the name of a company which leads, I think it is, on customer data and the demographics and buying patterns. Could you just share that information again? I think someone's interested in that. And also the question around entry type of deal for a green exporter. Both questions to Jay.
So entry type for green exporter. I mean, unfortunately, we're not in the fresh produce area. But no, so now we are actually not geared for that at this point in time. Having only recently built the freezer, so currently only in the frozen goods area. On the second question, basically, Dunn Humphrey is a research company. It's an American research-based company that globally they collect data and they're measuring what the consumer behavior is and seeing, measuring when they're in the store and they're looking for a product. What makes them change the decision? If they do not find a product they normally buy, how do they decide and what do they buy as a next choice? It gives an insight on the buying pattern of the consumer. So this sort of data is collected, and which is what the supermarkets are now actually using for deciding what to actually list as a product to keep and what to delete.
Okay, and a follow-up question for Jay. What is the top 5 products from the Pacific you are looking to import at the moment?
Currently, I mean, it was quite interesting when I heard on, because now I've got a new facility in frozen products. So now obviously I'm looking for anything that's viable for us. So Daruka will be definitely one that I'll be looking for. Okra, as it was mentioned, that now if it's done is another one. Bora beans, I don't know, pigeon beans, I would say that's another one that's probably a product that I'll be looking for.
So we've got growers from Tonga on the line. We've got growers from Samoa, Solomon. So what would be your advice to those countries?
So those are the products. I mean, if they have got the farming climates do sort of conjure for them to plant that, it's from any part of the Pacific that can get that product. We'd be happy to look at that.
Okay. And would you be in a position, either yourselves with or through Pacific Trade Invest New Zealand, to offer to the Pacific Island countries those very intricate information about windows of opportunity, which products at which times of the year, etc.?
Yeah, definitely.
In the market, you would know, right?
Yeah, definitely we would. Obviously now with tropical climate, obviously the products have got a season, so what is available and what's not. So now once we have a good understanding of that, because supply is quite an important aspect, especially when you're talking about talking to the supermarkets. I mean, you cannot have stop-start scenario with them.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Jay. Now a question to all of you on the panel. What would you offer as pearls of wisdom to growers and exporters from Tonga, aside from their watermelons, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, for example? So Tuvalu is, I guess, would be concentrating on maybe fisheries products as opposed to agriculture. So for all of you on the panel, what would be your advice to these countries looking to export to New Zealand?
Talk to people like Ashen Ventures. Of course, we've got the market knowledge. I mean, we're open. I mean, you can always contact us in terms of now trying to see where the opportunities can come out from, because we are talking to our customers every day. We've got people on the ground who are working throughout the country, and they're feeding back all the information where the gaps are.
Jay, just on that, there's a lot of, and I mentioned this earlier on about the stuff that's coming in from the Pacific, the fresh and frozen, mainly fresh, that's coming in from the Pacific Island countries into the informal markets. Again, that's a pure supply demand issue, right? There's a high level of demand from the diaspora wanting their cassavas and taros and fish and kava and what have you. How do we turn those into a business opportunity for exporters who for a long time have chosen to go down the path of that supply targeting that informal market here in New Zealand? Is there an opportunity, so say in Tonga, for those wanting to get into cassava or taro more so than what they're currently doing? And what would be your advice to them?
Yeah, so the target market is obviously, the product can be from any Pacific Island country because the population base here is from different parts of the Pacific. And sometimes there's allegiance to their own country that they want products from. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now it's a matter of getting the right form, because now you've got so many different species of taro or cassava. So now opportunities are there, really.
Yeah. Alo, based on your experience with the coconut industry in Samoa, what would you offer as some suggestions to growers in Tonga?
Thank you. I guess like Mr. Akoi was referring to, is that the relationship between the farmers and also the processors and the exporters is very important. And that relationship has to be coming from what most of the presenters have been saying, is understanding the market overseas, like what Mr. Patel has been saying, understanding what the requirements are and all that is very important before we start. So I guess before that will trickle down to the exporter with the right price or whatever. The market, the product going overseas is a pathway to go to get there. And then the benefits will come back to the farmers through higher prices. So I guess that relationship between the processors and the farmers is very important. Communications and also what requirements need to be done right from the grassroots, all through the supply chain, all the way to the market. So I guess we have to, for the processors and the exporters, to really understand what the market is about. Talking with Jay, it's really hit the nail on the head there. We really had to understand what the markets are before we plant anything or before we start anything, so that we have that pathway to success, which is very important going forward. So that's my advice. So, yeah.
Thank you, Alo. Thank you very, very much. A question or a few questions for MPI. The first one is on kava, and this is to both Nada and Alipate, who is to answer. So kava is a growing industry, obviously, and one of heightened interest to growers and exporters across the Pacific, as well as here in the New Zealand market. And you mentioned Codex, sorry, gosh. What would you say to growers and exporters in the kava industry in the kava producing countries of the Pacific, insofar as this market is concerned? Is it a mature, is the New Zealand market mature? And I'm talking about the formal market, not the informal, where we have a lot of grog swipers. But is there a formal market for New Zealand, and is it an emerging market, one which kava producing countries from the Pacific ought to know about?
Sorry, Glenys, I need to excuse myself.
Oh, okay, Jay.
Sorry.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Jay. Appreciate it. Thank you. We'll be in touch. Manaka. Alipate, you're on mute.
I'll just unmute it. I remember a while back there was a cover pilot program that MPI was involved in, and and the main objective of that is to allow the commercialization of importation of cover. That was discussed, I think, between New Zealand and Australia was the facilitator of that particular item, and that was shared back. I think it was early this year, around about April, between the two countries. There's definitely conversations going on in there between the two countries, but I don't understand the specifics though, so I can always go back and check it and provide that to the forum. I have a document in front of me about what was discussed between the two countries at that meeting, but I just gotta have to figure out what I can and can't reveal at this stage.
That's fine. That's fine. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
From your side, was there anything that you can offer for those in the cover sector?
Cover sector. I can remember the discussion that Alberto was referring to. This was because of the commitment that was made by Australia to the Pacific, where they were going to increase the allocation to the I think to the passengers coming into Australia, and that was supposed to be 2023 or 2025. But now I think the foreign ministers, they've pushed for, you're shaking your head, Glenis, you know this, they're pushing for that to be like done as quickly as they could. So that's the whole reason why Australia is involved. But I think from the biosecurity end, I remember there used to be few exporters. I'm just saying this because we were invited to sit in one of the meetings whereby a consignment of cover was held at the border in Auckland. That was when I then realized that he was big in terms of cover exports to New Zealand. He operates, I think, in Nauru, in Fiji. And he's been sending like 2 containers of cover a month. So I think there is a market, but I think formally that's still yet to be established and ascertained. But I think there needs to be more work done in this area in determining to determine the size of the market and how cover is actually consumed right across the country, Glenis.
Okay. All right, thank you. Tony, there's a question for you around,
Sure.
sorry. How do you test your product for contamination?
That's a good question. We, off our farm, obviously, we don't use any pesticides or herbicides. So that product is, we know what goes into it, which is pretty much why we've chosen the path of more or less organic production. Off our outgrower network, it's kind of like an honesty system. We actually ask the growers, how they do it, and we have a close relationship with them, which we've established over a few years, and we keep dealing with the same guys. So we sort of know what they do in their operations, and that provides us those assurances. Right?
Thank you. The issue of testing and contamination applies to any produce, not just cassava taro. So, Alo, in your case for coconuts and the coconut products and other products that your council with your members, how would you respond to this question around contamination and your testing method?
I guess we're sort of like in the same boat as Tony. it's more or less about what we know our farmers. So so there is some inspection that goes into it. We do go and inspect the farms just in case that there is some spraying with weed, insects, pesticides or weedicides. But more or less, we do have just trust our farmers that they are doing the right thing, which most of them do anyway. So, because most of us, especially with the coconut plantations here, it's basically just manual labor, maintaining the farms through weed control. So that's about it. Yeah, that's what we trust our farmers and the relationships we have with them, that they will maintain natural, which is organically but not certified at the moment, practices. So
yeah, okay. Thank you both for that. Look, I'm just conscious of the time. We've gone well over an hour, and I'm sure we could spend the rest of the afternoon covering off on the questions and me picking your brains from here. I really have to bring this day one to a close, and in doing so, I offer on behalf of my team at Pacific Trade Invest New Zealand our sincerest gratitude to each and every one of you for giving up your time today to join us on this webinar. Your experiences through your presentations have been extremely worthwhile, and I'm sure that those listening in would have learned quite a few new things that they didn't know yesterday, that they know today. So thank you very, very much. To those registered and online, we will be sharing with you, as I said earlier on, the presentations and the context of the presenters for today's session. We will also get through all of the questions, either through the sessions tomorrow or offline, probably on Thursday or Friday. I'll have to talk to Rohan about that. So again, Vinaka Vakalevu, thank you very, very much for your time. Most appreciated, and we'll talk again soon. Vinaka. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Commissioner.